finding a killer. With the Bentley's truck and camper identified, investigators restarted and started their entire investigation from fresh again. The truck being hidden so well in a very thick wooded area in a ravine was fairly curious to the investigators. Police actually had to chop down a significant amount of trees just to get the truck out of there and process it. According to an article in the Vancouver Sun, the underbrush was so thick that RCMP officials who were flying any sort of helicopter or plane would never have been able to see the vehicle among the brush. It was so covered in foliage it just wouldn't have been noticeable. One search and rescue volunteer told the newspaper that in the remote area where the camper was found, you could easily be only 15 feet away from it and not even know it was there. That's genuinely how dense these woods are. RCMP told the news outlets that since this was in such a remote and hard to get to area, that only someone who was local and lived in this area for a long amount of time would likely be the person who committed this. When detectives searched the surrounding area, they did notice it wasn't very far from a cliff. RCMP had deduced that the driver had likely intended to launch the vehicle off the cliff into the ravine, but evidently they were not able to get as far as they had wanted. The truck was so severely burned they weren't even able to tell if the aluminum boat was still attached to the top or not. The truck body, camper shell, and the interior had all melted into each other, forming basically one big massive pile of wreckage. Unfortunately, this meant that finding any sort of forensic evidence like DNA, fingerprints, hair, etc. would basically be impossible. Cleansed by fire, if you will. One notable discovery at the camper, though, was a single .22 caliber bullet hole on the side of the camper. At this point, investigators re-canvassed and re-interviewed everyone who lived in Clearwater and the surrounding areas, trying to resurface any clues they may have missed the first time around. They no longer believed the killer had left Canada. They now believed they had taken off into other provinces. Officials with the RCMP were very confident that the killer was a local, and they likely only needed a .22 caliber gun and an axe to get away with this crime. Police officers brought in dozens of people for questioning and interviews. They ran 24/7 surveillance on many people with extensive criminal backgrounds in the area, and of course made every single one of them take polygraphs. And according to news reports that I could find, every single one of them seemingly passed those polygraphs. According to the Wells Gray Gunman documentary, after 2 weeks of doing this non-stop, authorities finally caught a break when they visited the home of an elderly couple living in Clearwater. Before leaving the man and woman's home, the wife brought up and said, "Tell the officers something Dave said." The husband was reluctant to elaborate, but eventually with some coaxing by the RCMP, did further share details. A man a few months earlier named Dave had asked them how you would register a vehicle with a bullet hole in the side of it. Kind of a strange question, right? Bingo! At the time, RCMP thought they had finally found their red herring. Also at the time, authorities never had released any information about there being a bullet hole in the door of the truck. They had mentioned that all the victims had been shot to death, but they had never ever said anything about the caliber or the extent of the damage done to the vehicles. They had just said they had been burned. They never said anything about any bullet shots, any gun holes, anything like that. The couple told officers the man they knew as Dave was 24 years old. His full name was David William Shearing. They said in the summer of 1983 he had recently moved to the Clearwater area after living on his family's farm, just outside of the Wells Gray Park area. RCMP had apparently interviewed David once before, earlier on in the investigation as they were going door to door for any sort of tips or information. At the time though, apparently nothing about David seemed very suspicious or off-putting to the officers. When the police tried to locate him in late October of 1983, they discovered he no longer lived in Clearwater. Of course, why would he stay around, right? They dug into his background fairly deeply and found that he was actually connected to another set of murders in British Columbia. In that incident, a witness came forward and claimed that David had hit a victim with his car just outside of Wells Gray Provincial Park. David had allegedly struck the vehicle, ran them over, and never looked back. RCMP searched for the records and realized that nobody had ever been arrested or accused for that crime. I mean, somebody died, and nobody ever got justice. David, luckily, remains the only suspect. David at the time was living in an area known as Tumbler Ridge, British Columbia, which is about 900 miles north of Wells Gray Park. That's quite the trek. Maybe you're running from something, huh? RCMP investigators reached out to the local RCMP chief investigator in that area. His name was Ron German. Ron told the homicide investigators that he was aware who David Shearing was because he had arrested him multiple times for petty theft and traffic violations. Ron said that David would never look him in the eyes, which was always off-putting, and had a general demeanor of being unsavory and definitely not trustworthy. Just a few months after David had moved to Tumbler Ridge, Ron had pulled him over for a routine traffic stop. He noticed David was hauling a bunch of newer-looking tools in the back of his pickup truck. When the detective asked David where these tools had come from, he claimed that they were his and he was coming back from a work site. The next day, Ron got a call from 2 stores in town that they were missing over $40,000 worth of tools that had been stolen. Ron arrested David for the theft, but Canadian laws in the 1980s for theft were fairly lax and they weren't very heavy-handed, if you would. So unfortunately, David was released and continued to commit misdemeanors and thefts throughout the town. When Ron learned that David was the main suspect for the Bentley Johnson murders, he immediately knew he had to arrest him as quickly as he could. However, his counterparts in Clearwater told him to hold off, at least just for now. They wanted to surveil David a bit more and see if they could gather any more information that could incriminate him further. Exactly 1 month and a day after the discovery of the burnt-out camper, RCMP team led by Chief Ron German approached David as he was getting off of a local bus to come into the station for some questioning. David asked if he was under arrest and Ron said no. Ron said he and David rode for 2 hours in his squad car until they reached the RCMP post in Dawson's Creek. This place would be better equipped with interrogation rooms that would help keep it a bit more private, as well as recording what was going on inside the investigation room. The entire drive, David was calm, didn't really say much. He sat in the back seat with no handcuffs on, smoking a cigarette. But Ron? He was anything but calm. Once at Dawson's Creek, Ron German handed over David to RCMP investigator Michael Eastham and another detective from Clearwater. Now, Michael was actually the only RCMP investigator I was able to actually get pictures of for this video for you. Even though they didn't have any physical evidence that would tie David to the murders in the Wells Gray Park area, they decided to try to push forward and get a confession anyway. Investigator Eastham asked David about the hit and run that he was apparently cited at. Eastham told filmmaker Steve Allen that at the first mention of the hit and run, David immediately softened up and honestly appeared to be relieved. Within just a few minutes, David completely confessed to the deadly hit and run. Leaning into David's sense of relief for confessing about the hit and run, authorities then confronted him about the Bentley and Johnson murders. For more than 45 minutes, authorities talk all about the details of this case. Everything they were talking about with David was public knowledge. They discussed the victims, where their burnt cars were found, and then investigator Eastham asked David if he remembered about hearing where the victims had been killed. David answered and said Bear Creek Campground. Now this was finally the investigator's ace in the hole. The RCMP had never said anything publicly about the campground. The location of what the investigators believed to be the initial crime scene was always kept very close to their chests, and never one time was it discussed in the public. David had slipped up, and Eastham had knew it. The next few moments were incredibly crucial for the investigators to get David to confess to these murders. They told news outlets that the moment David realized he had said the location of the murders, he began to sweat profusely. He began chain-smoking cigarettes and becoming combative. The RCMP investigators did not let up there though. They became much more aggressive with their line of questioning, and after around 30 minutes of this, David broke down and began to cry. He had confessed that he had done all 6 killings and disposed of the family's belongings. The confession. After writing a full confession, David agreed to create a full map of the Wells Gray Park. and walked through how he stalked and killed the families all the way back in August of 1982. He saw the group several times at Bear Creek campsite while driving to and from his parents' ranch in the area. One night, he snuck down to the area and caught the family by surprise while they were relaxing around the campfire. He said Bob Johnson saw him come out of the woods with a gun and fired at him first. He then shot and killed George, Jackie, and Edith at point-blank range. He said the last two people he shot were Karen and Janet. He swore that his only motivation behind killing the family was to steal their possessions, vehicles, and tools. Investigators didn't believe theft to be a strong motivator to kill 6 people, and if you're asking me personally, I don't know if that's necessarily a motivator for killing 6 people either. They suspected that the crime was more sexually motivated, specifically towards Karen and Janet. After several more hours of questioning, Eastham asked him directly if he sexually assaulted the girls. David eventually relented and confessed that he did, in fact, abduct Karen and Janet from the campsite after the killings. He kept them alive for several days in the woods, so he could continue assaulting them when he felt like it. He took them to his parents' ranch in a remote cabin in the woods. At one point, David said a prison guard working around the area in Clearwater where his cabin was came knocking on the door one day. Apparently, Karen and Janet were inside, still alive. David was able to get the guard to leave, but this encounter spooked him. Fearing that he would be caught, David took the 2 girls out to the woods and shot them the very next day. He then placed their bodies in the trunk of their Plymouth, doused it in gasoline, and set it ablaze, hoping to hide any trace of evidence. While walking the police through his crime, he had taken detectives to his family's farm and showed them multiple items that he had kept hidden. Multiple of these belongings belonged to the Bentleys and Johnsons. In the hiding spot, he also showed the investigators the .22 caliber rifle he had used to kill the family. The announcement of the arrest of the mass murderer sent shockwaves but relief through the Canadian public. Most were glad to see someone being held responsible for the killings, but many in Clearwater who knew David were stunned to learn that he was the culprit. Former high school classmates and friends of David in the town described him as quiet, polite, and, highly intellectual. Apparently he never really got into fights, never really had any problems, but what they say about the quiet kids. His mother, Rose, did tell the newspaper that David never really had a steady girlfriend or any sort of strong friendship. He was the youngest of 3 children and had always worked odd jobs his entire life. He mainly lived in the Clearwater area and basically stayed at home for most of his time. In 1983, he finally moved out of the family ranch to Tumbler Ridge to apparently find work at a coal mine in the area. David's former employer said that sometime in 1982, when David's father died, it really seemed to affect him. Apparently, his father died of a heart attack. Apparently, this event was so upsetting that he had to emphasize this by committing mass murder, but hey, to each their own. On April 16, 1984, David would finally go to trial for the murders.